In the heart of East Africa, a nation once called the Pearl of Africa by Winston Churchill would become the stage for one of history's most notorious dictators. Uganda, a land of breathtaking beauty and tremendous potential, fell under the shadow of a man whose name would become synonymous with brutality and excess. Idi Amin Dada. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with an imposing physical presence, Amin's path to power began far from the presidential palace. Born in the remote northwestern region of Uganda around 1925 to a Kakwa father and Lugbera mother, his early years remain shrouded in contradiction and myth, much like the man himself would become. His childhood was marked by abandonment. When Amin was a young boy, his father deserted the family, leaving his mother to raise him alone. With little formal education, the young Amin found limited opportunities in colonial Uganda. But his imposing physique would open an unexpected door. In 1946, Amin joined the King's African Rifles, a regiment of the British colonial army. Here, the illiterate young man found structure, purpose, and a path forward. The military would become his education, his foundation, and ultimately his ladder to absolute power. Amin was an exemplary soldier physically, notes historian Robert Lugalobi. But what many fail to recognize is how thoroughly he absorbed the colonial military mindset, the belief that force was the primary tool of governance. Rising through the ranks during Britain's brutal campaign against the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya, Amin learned counterinsurgency tactics that he would later deploy against his own people. He was a quick study in violence. By Uganda's independence in 1962, he had risen to become one of the first 2 Ugandans to be commissioned as officers in the newly formed Ugandan army. When Milton Obote, Uganda's first prime minister, needed a loyal military man, he found in Amin a willing partner. Their relationship would define Uganda's early independence and set the stage for its darkest chapter. In 1966, Obote faced a political crisis. Accused of corruption involving gold and ivory smuggled from neighboring Congo, he moved to consolidate power. Obote sent Amin, then deputy commander of the army, to attack the palace of the Kabaka, Uganda's ceremonial king. The assault left hundreds dead and forced the king into exile. For his loyalty, Amin was rewarded. He became commander of Uganda's armed forces, a position that gave him control of the military and the loyalty of its soldiers. But as Obote's paranoia grew, so did the rift between the 2 men. Obote made a fatal miscalculation, explains political scientist Olivia Mugisha. He believed Amin was merely a blunt instrument, a man who could be controlled. He failed to see the cunning intelligence behind Amin's seemingly simple demeanor. By 1971, rumors swirled that Obote planned to arrest Amin on charges of misappropriating military funds. Amin, away from the capital attending a swimming competition, received word of the plot. He acted decisively. On January 25, 1971, while Obote was attending a Commonwealth meeting in Singapore, Amin struck. In a swift military coup, he seized control of the country. Initial reactions, both within Uganda and internationally, were largely positive. Obote had become increasingly authoritarian, and many saw Amin as a stabilizing force. People danced in the streets, recalls journalist Thomas Mpuga, who witnessed the coup. There was genuine hope that this charismatic military man might restore Uganda's fortunes. How quickly that hope would turn to horror. Amin's first address to the nation promised reconciliation and elections within months. Western nations, particularly Britain, welcomed the change in leadership, but those who looked closer saw troubling signs. Within days of taking power, Amin ordered the execution of troops suspected of loyalty to Obote. These killings marked only the beginning. What followed would be an 8-year reign of terror that would leave as many as 300,000 Ugandans dead, the economy in ruins, and a nation's soul deeply scarred. As Amin consolidated his grip on power, his true nature began to emerge. The smiling, jovial public figure gave way to a paranoid and brutal dictator whose methods of torture and murder would shock the world. Uganda was about to descend into what would later be called a state of blood. The early days of Amin's rule gave little indication of the horrors to come. He released political prisoners, promised economic reforms, and cultivated an image of a man of the people. With his infectious laugh and seemingly straightforward manner, he charmed foreign correspondents and ordinary Ugandans alike. He was a masterful performer, notes media historian Catherine Nabukira. Amin understood intuitively how to manipulate his public image long before the era of media consultants and PR advisors. His persona as the simple soldier disarmed critics even as he consolidated absolute power. This facade quickly crumbled. Within weeks of taking power, Amin established military tribunals that operated outside the law. Soldiers loyal to former President Milton Obote were the first targets, with hundreds summarily executed. But the circle of victims would rapidly expand. By March 1971, Amin had created the State Research Bureau and the Public Safety Unit, ostensibly intelligence organizations that would become his primary instruments of terror. Operating from nondescript buildings in Kampala, these agencies abducted, tortured, and murdered those perceived as threats to Amin's rule. Joseph Kamuli, a rare survivor of the State Research Bureau's headquarters at Nakasero, described the facility. It was a factory of death. The screams never stopped. Day and night, people begged for mercy that never came. The floors were slick with blood. As paranoia gripped Amin, his definition of enemy expanded beyond political opponents. Ethnicity became a death sentence. Members of the Akoli and Lango tribes, groups associated with Obote, were systematically eliminated from the military and government, then targeted for extermination. Military roadblocks appeared across Uganda, where soldiers checked identity cards for tribal affiliations. Those from the wrong tribe were often never seen again. Bodies began appearing in rivers and lakes, particularly Lake Victoria, in such numbers that workers at the Owen Falls Dam reported that corpses clogged the machinery. The killings were not random, explains genocide scholar Dr. Richard Waswa. They followed a pattern of eliminating specific groups perceived as threats. This was structural violence aimed at reshaping Uganda's power dynamics through terror. In September 1972, Amin made a decision that would dramatically alter Uganda's demographic and economic landscape. Claiming divine guidance through a dream, he announced the expulsion of Uganda's Asian population, approximately 60,000 people, many of whose families had lived in Uganda for generations. The Asians, primarily of Indian descent, controlled much of Uganda's commerce and industry. Given just 90 days to leave, they were forced to abandon businesses, homes, and possessions built over decades. The economic impact was immediate and devastating. It was economic suicide, states economist Dr. Martin Byamukama. Overnight, Uganda lost its merchant class, its tax base, and its economic infrastructure. But Amin wasn't concerned with economics. He was redistributing wealth to secure loyalty. The abandoned businesses were handed to Amin's supporters and military officers with no experience in management. Factories fell idle, supply chains collapsed, and shortages of basic goods became commonplace. Uganda's once thriving economy began a free fall that would see per capita income drop by 40% during Amin's rule. As Uganda descended into economic chaos, Amin sought distractions. He awarded himself increasingly grandiose titles, eventually settling on His Excellency, President for Life, Field Marshal Al-Haji Dr. Idi Amin Dada, VC, DSO, MC, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the seas, and conqueror of the British Empire in Africa in general and Uganda in particular. Behind this facade of buffoonery, the killing continued. Archbishop Janani Luwum, a vocal critic of the regime's human rights abuses, was arrested in February 1977. The government claimed he died in a car accident, but his body, when returned to his family, showed clear signs of torture and gunshot wounds. Dora Bloch, a 75-year-old Israeli hostage during the Entebbe crisis, was dragged from her hospital bed and murdered after Israeli commandos rescued the other hostages. Foreign Minister Michael Ondoga disappeared after a cabinet meeting and was later found dismembered. The violence served a purpose, explains political psychologist Dr. Sarah Nakamuli. It was performative, designed to demonstrate that no one was safe, that loyalty was the only protection, and that Amin's power was absolute. Fear became the primary tool of governance. By the mid-1970s, Amin had transformed Uganda into what historian Robert Mazrui called a slaughterhouse of a state. With the economy collapsing and international isolation growing, Amin would soon look outward for enemies to distract from the catastrophe he had created at home. As Amin's rule entered its middle years, the dictator became increasingly erratic. Those closest to him lived in constant fear, knowing favor could turn to fatal suspicion in an instant. Cabinet ministers disappeared with alarming regularity, often replaced by military officers with no qualifications beyond loyalty to Amin. Working in Amin's government was tantamount to a death sentence with an uncertain date of execution, remarks political historian Dr. Emmanuel Segitoleko. Between 1971 and 1979, over two-thirds of his cabinet ministers were either executed or fled into exile. The instruments of state power were redirected toward maintaining Amin's cult of personality. The national radio broadcaster became a propaganda outlet, its announcers carefully reading scripts praising His Excellency, the Life President. News cameras followed Amin constantly, recording his athletic prowess as he swam, boxed, or played basketball, activities meant to reinforce his image of vitality and strength. Behind this carefully managed public persona, Amin's private life was equally outsized. He married at least 6 women officially, though rumors suggested dozens more unofficial wives. His sexual conquests became matters of state importance, with women reportedly abducted if they caught his eye. Sarah Kiolaba, a teenage dancer with a national folk troupe, became his 5th wife in 1975, after being spotted during a performance. The lavish public wedding featured a cake shaped like Lake Victoria and cost over $2 million at a time when ordinary Ugandans were struggling to afford basic necessities. As the economy continued its free fall, Amin found sustenance in international relationships that overlooked his brutality in favor of strategic advantages. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi became a primary benefactor, providing financial support and military equipment. The Soviet Union, seeing an opportunity to gain influence in East Africa, supplied MiG fighter jets and technical advisors. Amin played Cold War politics masterfully, notes international relations scholar Dr. Patricia Mugambe. He understood that as long as he positioned Uganda as strategically valuable, some world power would overlook his domestic atrocities. This international support emboldened Amin to take increasingly provocative stances on the world stage. He sent telegrams insulting world leaders, offered to mediate in the Northern Ireland conflict, and declared himself the conqueror of the British Empire, while demanding Queen Elizabeth II send him her underwear. While these eccentricities earned him headlines and sometimes dismissive laughter internationally, Ugandans found nothing amusing about his rule. The economy had collapsed so thoroughly that basic goods disappeared from market shelves. Inflation soared to over 1,000%, rendering the Ugandan shilling nearly worthless. Soldiers, often unpaid, set up roadblocks to extort money from travelers. Government offices functioned as extortion rackets, with bribes required for any official service. For ordinary Ugandans, daily life became an exercise in survival. "We lived like hunted animals," recalls Rebecca Nakato, who was a university student during Amin's regime. You never knew if a casual comment overheard might be reported to the wrong ears. You never knew if a roadblock might be your last. You never knew if a knock at night meant your family would never see you again. By 1976, Uganda had become a pariah state, but Amin remained dangerous on the international stage. In July of that year, terrorists from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine hijacked an Air France flight and directed it to Entebbe Airport in Uganda. The 248 passengers, many of them Israeli, were held hostage with Amin's apparent support. The subsequent Israeli rescue operation, now known as Operation Thunderbolt, humiliated Amin. Israeli commandos flew 2,500 miles to rescue the hostages, killing Ugandan soldiers and destroying fighter jets on the ground before departing. Amin, who had positioned himself as a military genius, had been outmaneuvered on his own territory. His response was predictable: more violence. Dora Bloch, an elderly hostage who had been taken to a hospital before the raid, was dragged from her bed and murdered. Uganda's Jewish community, already diminished, faced new persecution. As domestic conditions worsened and international isolation grew, Amin searched for a way to unify the country behind him. He found his answer in the time-tested strategy of dictators throughout history: a foreign enemy. Amin needed an external threat, explains military historian Colonel James Opio, RET. His power derived from fear, but even fear has diminishing returns. He needed Ugandans to rally behind him against a common enemy. In October 1978, Amin made the fateful decision that would ultimately end his reign. He ordered an invasion of neighboring Tanzania, claiming disputed territory in the Kagera salient. Ugandan troops CR. The invasion of Tanzania proved to be Amin's fatal miscalculation. Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere, a principled Pan-Africanist who had long condemned Amin's brutality, responded with unexpected force. Rather than merely reclaiming the Kagera salient, Nyerere committed to removing Amin from power entirely. Nyerere made a moral calculation, explains international relations scholar Dr. Michael Luanga. He understood that African unity, a cherished ideal of post-colonial leadership, could not coexist with Amin's barbarism. Someone had to end the nightmare. In January 1979, Tanzanian forces, alongside Ugandan exiles formed as the Uganda National Liberation Army, UNLA, launched a counteroffensive. Amin's forces, despite years of preferential funding and Soviet equipment, crumbled with surprising speed. The military that had terrorized unarmed civilians proved ineffective against disciplined opposition. Many soldiers deserted rather than fight. Others, particularly the elite units staffed with mercenaries from Sudan and Nubia, fought fiercely but were overwhelmed by superior numbers and motivation. As the Tanzanian-led forces advanced toward Kampala, Amin's regime began to implode. His inner circle, sensing the end was near, fled with whatever wealth they could carry. Military commanders abandoned their posts. The apparatus of terror that had maintained his rule disintegrated in weeks. On April 11, 1979, Kampala fell. Amin was nowhere to be found. He had fled first to Libya, whose leader Muammar Gaddafi had been a steadfast supporter, before eventually settling in Saudi Arabia, which granted him asylum on the condition he remain politically inactive. Uganda's liberation was met with jubilation. Crowds danced in the streets, embracing Tanzanian soldiers as liberators. The instruments of Amin's terror, the State Research Bureau headquarters, military barracks, and detention centers were thrown open, revealing horrors that shocked even those who had lived under his rule. What we found defies description, recalls Dr. Samuel Walugembe, a physician who volunteered to examine torture chambers after liberation. Instruments designed solely to inflict maximum pain, rooms where floors and walls were caked with dried blood, the stench of death that no amount of cleaning could remove. Particularly infamous was the so-called disappearance room at the State Research Bureau headquarters, where victims were bludgeoned to death with sledgehammers. Nearby was a room containing crocodile pools, where some victims were allegedly fed to the reptiles. Refrigerators contained dismembered body parts, some apparently kept as trophies. The economic devastation paralleled the human toll. Uganda's infrastructure lay in ruins. Government institutions existed in name only. Records had been destroyed or never kept. The treasury was empty, with even the coins removed from the central bank. An estimated 60% of doctors, lawyers, teachers, and civil servants had been killed or had fled the country. Amin didn't just kill people, he killed institutions, notes economist Dr. Florence Namuganza. He destroyed the civil service, the judiciary, the educational system, everything that makes a modern state function. Uganda wasn't merely damaged, it was systematically dismantled. The post-Amin governments faced overwhelming challenges. Milton Obote, the man Amin had overthrown 8 years earlier, returned to power following problematic elections in 1980. His second administration, rather than healing Uganda's wounds, inflicted fresh ones through renewed tribal persecution and economic mismanagement. A series of coups and counter-coups followed until 1986, when Yoweri Museveni's National Resistance Army took power, bringing relative stability. Museveni, who remains president today, began the long process of rebuilding Uganda's shattered institutions and economy. Meanwhile, Amin lived in comfortable exile in Saudi Arabia. He maintained a low profile, occasionally appearing in news reports showing him shopping or swimming, but largely fading from public consciousness. Despite international arrest warrants and calls to face justice for crimes against humanity, he never stood trial. Amin's escape from justice represents one of the great failures of international accountability, argues human rights attorney Irene Kegwa. Before the International Criminal Court, before the tribunals for Rwanda and Yugoslavia, there was Amin, a clear case for prosecution that the world simply chose to ignore. On August 16, 2003, after decades in exile, Idi Amin died in a Saudi hospital from kidney failure. His family requested he be buried in Saudi Arabia, fearing his remains would be desecrated if returned to Uganda. There was no official mourning in the country he had once ruled through terror. For Ugandans, Amin's physical death was almost irrelevant. The damage he inflicted lives on in broken families, traumatized communities, and developmental opportunities. The shadow of Idi Amin stretches far beyond the 8 years of his rule. Decades later, Uganda still bears the scars of his regime, visible in everything from its politics to its collective psychology. Understanding Amin's enduring impact requires looking beyond the man to examine how societies recover from systematic trauma. What makes Amin's legacy so powerful is that he didn't just kill individuals, he attacked the very social fabric, explains sociologist Dr. Rebecca Nakibuka. He deliberately targeted intellectuals, religious leaders, judges, anyone who represented institutional memory or moral authority. These aren't losses that can be quickly regenerated. The statistics tell part of the story. Up to 300,000 killed, thousands more disappeared, 60,000 Asians expelled, and countless others forced into exile. But numbers fail to capture the cascading effects of this devastation across generations. Uganda's educational system, once among Africa's finest, was gutted. Makerere University, the Harvard of Africa, saw its international standing collapse as professors were murdered or fled. Primary and secondary schools lost teachers by the thousands. An entire generation received diminished education, creating a knowledge gap that persisted for decades. My father was a history professor who was taken one night in 1973, recounts journalist David Mugisha. He wasn't particularly political, but he had questioned a government directive about curriculum. Not only did we lose him, but his students lost his knowledge, and their students lost what those students would have learned. The ripples go on and on. The economic devastation proved equally persistent. When Amin expelled Uganda's Asian community, he eliminated not just individual business people but entire commercial networks built over generations. Supply chains collapsed, institutional knowledge vanished, and capital fled. The country's GDP fell by 25% within 2 years. Rebuilding these economic structures proved far more difficult than destroying them. Uganda's economy didn't return to pre-Amin levels until the early 2000s, nearly 3 decades after his overthrow. An entire generation grew up in poverty that should never have existed. Perhaps most damaging was Amin's normalization of violence as a political tool. His regime demonstrated that brutality could be effective, at least in the short term. This lesson wasn't lost on those who followed him. After Amin, something fundamental changed in Uganda's political culture, notes political scientist Dr. Joseph Kigundu. Violence became an accepted language of power. Subsequent leaders, while not approaching Amin's extremes, still employed targeted violence against opposition. The threshold of what constitutes acceptable governance shifted dramatically. This normalization extended beyond politics into everyday life. Crime rates soared in the Post-Amin era, with former soldiers often turning to banditry. Domestic violence increased as traumatized men brought wartime behaviors home. Studies suggest that regions most targeted during Amin's rule continue to show higher rates of interpersonal violence decades later. For individual Ugandans, the psychological toll remains immeasurable. An estimated 80% of families lost at least one member to violence during Amin's regime. Traditional mourning practices were often impossible, as bodies disappeared or were dumped in mass graves. This interrupted grief created what psychologists call frozen mourning. Unresolved trauma passed through generations. My grandmother still sets a place at dinner for her son, who disappeared in 1977, shares social worker Anna Namagwanya. She's not delusional, she knows he's dead, but without a body, without a grave, there's no closure. That pain doesn't just stay with her. It affects how she raised my mother, which affects how my mother raised me. Uganda's religious institutions, which might have helped process this national trauma, were themselves targeted by Amin. When Archbishop Janani Luvum was murdered in 1977, it signaled that not even the highest religious authorities were safe. Many clergy fled or remained silent out of self-preservation, leaving spiritual voids in communities that desperately needed guidance. The international community shares responsibility for Amin's legacy. Initially welcomed by Western powers as an improvement over his predecessor, Amin received military aid and diplomatic recognition, even as evidence of atrocities mounted. Only when his economic policies threatened foreign Iharists did international opinion decisively turn against him. The world's slow response to Amin set a dangerous precedent, argues international relations scholar Dr. Simon Okello. It suggested that African lives were somehow less valuable, that African suffering was more acceptable. This double standard has been repeated in subsequent crises across the continent. Yet, within this bleak assessment, there are seeds of hope. The story of Idi Amin forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, accountability, and human nature. How does a man rise from humble beginnings to control an entire nation through fear? Why do institutions designed to check power so often fail? And how do societies heal from wounds that cut to their very core? Amin wasn't born a monster, observes psychologist Dr. Martin Sempa. He was created by systems that valued certain skills, intimidation, ruthlessness, physical force, and by international actors who found those qualities useful until they didn't. Understanding this doesn't excuse his crimes, but it helps us recognize how similar figures emerge. Indeed, Amin's rise offers cautionary lessons about militarization of politics. He emerged from a colonial army trained specifically for violence, not governance. When Uganda's early civilian leadership incorporated this military force into politics, they introduced an element that would ultimately consume the democratic experiment itself. These lessons extend beyond Uganda. The pattern of military strongmen seizing power, consolidating control through violence, and ruling through personality cults has repeated across continents and decades. From Mobutu in Zaire to Pinochet in Chile, the Amin playbook has proved disturbingly versatile. Yet equally instructive is Uganda's gradual recovery. Though imperfect and incomplete, the country's journey from the abyss of Amin's rule demonstrates human resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable trauma. Institutions have been rebuilt, albeit slowly. Democratic norms, though fragile, have taken root. The economy, once in free fall, has stabilized and grown. What happened in Uganda wasn't just about one man's cruelty, concludes historian Dr. Elizabeth Namazi. It was about how societies respond when their foundations are attacked, their values, their institutions, their very sense of humanity. Uganda's story since Amin is ultimately about the painstaking work of reconstruction, not just of buildings and economies, but of trust and community. Amin himself never faced justice for his crimes. His comfortable exile and peaceful death represent a failure of international accountability that would only begin to be addressed decades later, with the establishment of the International Criminal Court and various war crimes tribunals. For the families of his countless victims, this lack of justice remains an open wound. No trials established official records of atrocities. No truth commission created space for national healing. The full accounting of what happened under Amin's rule, exactly who was killed, how, and why, remains incomplete. Yet, in Ugandan communities, unofficial remembrance continues. Oral histories preserve what happened when official records were destroyed. Memorial services quietly honor those whose bodies were never recovered. New generations learn about this dark chapter not to perpetuate hatred, but to ensure vigilance against its repetition. As Uganda continues its long journey of healing, Amin's legacy serves as both warning and motivation, a reminder of how quickly civilized society can unravel, and how painstaking is the work of rebuilding what violence destroys. In this way, even the darkest chapter of Uganda's history contains lessons that illuminate the ongoing struggle for human dignity worldwide.